War! What is it good for? Business, the media, the government? Let's have one then. You know I read the comments, right? Loads of you in the comments are saying, Russell, do a video on what's happening between Russia and the Ukraine. Now, we know that there are complex relationships between Russia and America, historic Cold War and post-Cold War relationships. There are complicated relationships at play between Russia and the Ukraine, obviously. And I reckon one of the reasons we feel like it's difficult to understand what's actually happening is because we know that the mainstream media benefits in terms of ratings and therefore in terms of advertising revenue from there being a war. And we know that the military-industrial complex benefits from there being a war in terms of sales of munitions, arms and various other facilities. So how, in such a complex machine of duplicity and obfuscation, are we meant to understand the actual facts? Well, let's do our best in this video to break some of that stuff down. As 100 religious, social justice and veterans groups demand that President Biden stop escalating tensions over Ukraine, the White House continued to warn of a potential imminent invasion. People keep saying this war is going to happen. How can you schedule wars? There's going to be a war Wednesday. See you there for a war. The tension shouldn't be escalated either, should they, by Joe Biden? Whatever you think of Joe Biden, and I read the comments, so I know what you think of Joe Biden, he certainly was elected on a kind of platform of no more of these unnecessary wars. And you feel like, don't you, if you support someone like Biden, like, don't escalate this war then, particularly not if it is for the kind of interest that I've already lined. Economic interest, media interest. If that's what's behind it, then stop it. During Friday's White House press briefing, Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, said that Russian military action could begin any day now. Even as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky discourages panic and downplays the idea that a Russian invasion is imminent, American officials are portraying armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine as inevitable and US military support of Ukraine as necessary. He's the actual president. No, I don't think there's anything to worry about. It's okay, no need for war. No, there's gonna be a war, Vladimir. Essentially, that's a pincer movement, isn't it? It's inevitable. Our support is necessary. That means there's no decision to be made. They're talking about it as if it's meteorological, as if it's just a weather system that's happening that you can't do anything about. And obviously we have no choice but to support them. And I suppose a side effect of that is that we will make loads and loads of money. Now, I'm not saying there aren't complex issues at stake. I'm in no position to make such a verdict. I don't know enough about it. But I know that as a discerning viewer of media, and I know that's what you are too, that it raises questions. Journalist Joe Gill wrote that in the 21st century, the media war is a critical element of any pre-war planning, and this appears to be reaching its crescendo. Oh, so that's the bit we're in now. We're in the bit now where they prime us for a war. That's the bit where you sort of like, if you just ask someone on the street, is there going to be a war? Well, it seems inevitable. War is necessary. Where'd you get that? Television. The narratives repeated in the Western media are so thunderingly pro-Ukrainian and anti-Putin that it's hard to extract from the simplistic framing the complex nature of the conflict. By talking up the inevitability of a war in Ukraine against Russia, Western intelligence agencies and their media outliers are implanting the idea that war has already started. He continued, noting that Bloomberg even accidentally announced that Russia had invaded Ukraine. Bad news, everyone! Russia has invaded the Ukraine. Oh, sorry, that's not till tomorrow. We're still making a few missiles. Noting that the US and NATO are pouring in high-tech weaponry and training up Ukraine's armed forces, making it a much more military capable foe. They've always been doing this thing, America, and they popping over to places. Okay, guys, do you need some training? Why? What's going to happen? There's going to be a war. Why? Because we said so. Get ready for the war! From where the Russians are sitting, the deployment of billions of dollars worth of new US and UK military hardware on its borders is a sign of escalation rather than defence. So, of course, we are presented with information along the lines of, hey, it's necessary in terms of defence to get all this military hardware over there defensively. But from a Russian perspective, if we were watching a Russian news outlet, what they would say is, no, what that is escalation. You're bringing weaponry into a neighbouring territory with whom we have historic conflict. And you can certainly see that perspective. I know there are other people with much more experience with, military history than me that go, no, you're being naive. America has these, but all of those ideas, if you ask me, are being currently amplified by institutions and organisations that benefit from a war. Wouldn't you feel more comfortable that you had a great understanding of the current escalation if you were able to read a disclaimer like, no one will financially benefit from this war? And like the media, news media was saying, we're going to report on this in a sensible way rather than like day to day like this.
What do you think of the idea of a war now? I'll take that as a yes.
That's it, Chris.
It's war. This is a war.
That's it. Yes, it's war.
We're being primed for it. It escalates separate from the narrative. You might want to read those Baudrillard's essays, The Iraq War Didn't Happen, There Is No Iraq War. And what he's essentially saying is that war becomes such a media spectacle that it's actually deracinated from the reality of the situation. And I know that sounds like a complex philosophical notion, but just consider this. I'm not in the Ukraine. I'm not in Russia. Some of you will be and have been, but you don't bloody well know what's going on over there. All you know is what you're told. And what you're told is the result of certain interests. It's showing that mainstream media and corporate interests operate on their own strata, and their function is to make you be compliant and passive so that you don't go, what's actually happening here? We're kept in a state of peculiar delirium by the inundation of non-data to the point we don't even know what's real. So your confusion about Russia and Ukraine is part of the process, because if you actually understood it, you would go, well, why is that happening? Whose business is that? Who's doing it? Who benefits? That's what critical thinking would be in this instance. But critical thinking ain't facilitated by a media and corporate environment that continually sends out hypnotic messaging that disconnects you from the actual reality. The particular kind of crisis story that American officials are deploying in the situation with Ukraine is a familiar one. An underdog faces a threat from an authoritarian regime, so the United States must come to the rescue with a military response. They're always doing that one. It's like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But this time, Ant-Man. But this time, everybody's Russian. In a crisis, the American public is often discouraged from asking questions. And when they do, militarism is usually the answer. What's the alternative? Asked retired Brigadier General and former defence attaché to Moscow, Peter Zwack, in an interview on NPR. He's hardly an unbiased source. Whether it's my time doing wars or benefiting financially from wars, I've learned one thing. Wars. The choice being put forward is between military action or inaction. To opt for inaction is presented as an abandonment of Ukraine. We can't abandon Ukraine. Why do you care about the Ukraine all of a sudden? No, I love I've always liked the Ukraine. I liked the Ukraine before it was fashionable. It's not Radiohead. No, I've always liked them. See my Ukraine poster over there? Zwack's prescription is lethal weapons, specifically Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. Admittedly, they sound cool, but it is terrifying. And the US is delivering. In just over a week, the US made 4 shipments of weapons to the Ukraine, a move that has US arms manufacturers anticipating soaring profits for their shareholders. Some of the largest weapons companies in the world, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, have been openly telling their investors that tensions between the countries are good for business, and General Dynamics, meanwhile, is boasting about the past returns the company has seen as a result of such disputes. Here we go again. Jeremy Scahill, co-founder of The Intercept, wrote, retired Pentagon officials on the payroll of the defense industry are presented as experts. Yeah, that's what the tag should be. Retired Pentagon official on the payroll of the defense industry. They should tag them like that. Often with no disclosure of their financial conflicts of interest. Misinformation, anyone? Is that misinformation? And once the shooting starts, mainstream pundits will drop any remaining pretense of journalistic integrity and begin openly cheerleading for the troops. There's a format, isn't there? There's a format to how this functions. First of all, obfuscation and confusion. Then necessity and inevitability. Then the requirement for our support. What, are you unpatriotic? Don't you support the troops? Yeah, I do support the troops. Guess what form my support of the troops takes? Don't send them off to fight a war so that some people can make a profit. Then when they come home, don't provide them with the necessary healthcare that they require and neglect them and abandon them. That's my support for the troops. My support for the troops doesn't sound as much like support for the weapons industry, so maybe that's misinformation. You only need to look at how the Democratic Party and its affiliates spent the year so far responding to anti-war and de-escalatory arguments. These initially didn't come from left-wing or even liberal lawmakers and pundits, but from the right side of the political spectrum. Have we gone through some looking glass? Have we gone through, am I in Wonderland right now? Because when I was a kid, I was told this. The right wing, they want wars. The left wing, they're for the people. They're basically for the people. There's some complexity, there's a middle ground, but that's basically the rule. Doesn't mean anything anymore, does it? It doesn't mean anything. Maybe the most prominent of all has been Fox News' Tucker Carlson, who as far back as December 21 was admonishing Republicans for goading Biden into being more aggressive. Since then, he's continued to question Ukraine's strategic value to the United States and argue against war with Russia. Carlson's broadcast reportedly led some Republicans to adopt his same position on the Ukraine crisis, a notable shift for the party that has typically never met a war it didn't want to charge into. So, The terms right-wing and left-wing and the affiliated and associated ideologies appear to be mutable, don't they? And it's telling that even as Carlson continued to broadcast vile agitprop calling for the banishment of the homeless and fear-mongering about immigrants, stuff that I blatantly disagree with, it was his entirely sensible position on the Ukraine that got the most aggressive, widespread pushback from the liberal democratic side of the spectrum. Criticise the homeless all you like. They're smelly and they're expensive. But you do not criticise our profitable wars. We're liberals. On CNN, host Brianna Keeler accused Carlson of having a pro-Russia stance. Tucker's propaganda is very convenient for Russia. Like, you see that dude, Tucker Carlson? He ain't like, hello, Mr. Putin, how's it going, sir? He don't care about Russia, does he? He don't care. Ronald Reagan's son said, I don't want to throw words around like traitor or traitorism, but that's coming pretty close. It's on MSNBC where this kind of rhetoric is on overdrive, with talking heads accusing Carlson of shilling for Vladimir Putin. No one's got any morals, have they? No one's got any connection to any ancient principles of care and love when they're saying this stuff on MSNBC. And I bet they'll dare say, it's our obligation to help the people of Ukraine. They're in a lot of trouble over it. Won't they? They'll be coming up with all that kind of crap. It's like, come on, mate, do us a favour. You're shilling for weapons manufacturers and because your own certainty that ratings will improve if there is a war. Stop the pretense of doing the work of the autocratic Russian government, feeding people Russian propaganda and rooting for Russia. There's almost no alternative to these views on the network. That's astonishing, isn't it? Everyone has become detached from reality. That's what I feel like, that we are living in a spectacle, in a constructed reality, in a corporate machine. And our consciousness is like the fodder of this machine that just has to be moulded for the desired outcomes. Right, it's war now. Right, it's a pandemic. Right, it's this. And I'm not saying there's not a necessity for a war or that there isn't a pandemic. What I'm saying is there is a requirement for balanced, transparent, open conversation. And if you say that there isn't, that's not because you're anti-misinformation. It's because you are prizing particular information and likely profiting from it in tangible ways. It should hopefully be clear why this is so dangerous. If what Carlson's saying amounts to siding with Russia, parroting Kremlin propaganda and disloyalty and traitorism, then this applies to anyone else arguing against a war over Ukraine. I remember when it used to be that sort of patriotism and nationalism was purely the territory of a particular set of affiliations. The idea that this authoritarianism that we're experiencing now extends right into the tropes of the old right makes me feel like that nothing is real, nothing has any value. Here is the poisonous fruit of the Russiagate nonsense, which even some leftists humoured, believing it to be a harmless way to undermine Donald Trump in the short term. Instead, what's happened is that a liberal establishment that endlessly compares Trump to the demagogic Joseph McCarthy has now wholesale adopted McCarthy's style of reckless accusations and disloyalty charges, sprinkled with the Bush-era tendency to equate opposing war as being on the side of the enemy. Isn't it extraordinary that these particularly unpleasant interludes in American history have coalesced under an apparently liberal, progressive, democratic government? It makes me think these labels don't mean anything, that all anyone cares about is the ideological pursuit of their own gains, their own profit, their own financial interests. The result has been a marked hawkish turn on national security among the left-of-centre public. Tenuously construe anything as serving Russia's interests, and that idea becomes automatically illegitimate in the eyes of a large chunk of the US public. What we end up with is a powerful disincentive. After all, who wants the trouble of being blacklisted from cable news, or worse, face a news cycle accusing them of doing Putin's work? So there may well be a war between Russia and the Ukraine in the next day or two. Who knows? But what we can now tell for certain is that there are interests at play that would benefit from there being that war. And perhaps the reason we find it hard to understand the true reasons for there being that conflict is because the reporting on the war is confusing and beset with all kinds of conditioning and prejudices around patriotism and saying this is good and saying that is bad and you're pro-Russia and you're a traitor. It's once again obfuscated in endless rhetoric that is designed to benefit the interests of the powerful, be that the military-industrial complex or the mainstream media. Who knows? There may be legitimate reasons for a war between Russia and the Ukraine, and there may be reasons to support one of those sides in that war. What I will tell you with a degree of certainty is that unless money is removed from that situation, and unless you de-school yourself from the bugging you've received from the mainstream media, you'll never know whether it's right or wrong. Now I'd like to see you do that, Brian Stelter. That's just what